Snow drifted across the moors like pale ash from a dying world, swallowing the fields and hedgerows until Hawthorne Hall stood alone against the white horizon. Its chimneys breathed faint smoke into a sky the color of pewter. Inside, beneath the weight of ancestral portraits and marble columns, the Duke of Wexford returned to a home that felt more mausoleum than manor. The year was 1816, England's coldest in memory, when the sun seemed a rumor and every fire fought a losing war against the frost. Alexander, 24 and newly home from the continent, carried with him the silence of battlefields. He had ridden through smoke, commanded men, and buried friends. Yet now, in peace, he found himself among chandeliers and laughter, where the language of society felt more treacherous than any campaign. The faces that greeted him were powdered and smiling, voices lilting with congratulation and calculation alike. He felt a stranger in his own halls, burdened by honors that rang hollow in his ears. Far below the ballroom, in the heat and din of the kitchen, Charlotte Whitmore worked with quiet precision. At 23, she had long since learned the discipline of service, to move unseen, to listen without replying, to endure insult with grace. Her late mother had been the house cook, her father a farmer taken by fever. Charlotte had inherited both the skill of her mother's hands and her father's stubborn steadiness. She had known Hawthorne Hall since childhood, knew the sound of its clocks striking midnight, the chill of its cellars, the way its walls held whispers like secrets in stone. Tonight, every copper pot gleamed, every roast and pastry timed to perfection for the Duke's welcome feast. Yet the air in the kitchen was sharp with tension. Servants rushed, maids fretted, and orders came from above as though war had broken out between the dining room and the scullery. Charlotte moved through it all with calm purpose, though her heart thudded with the unfamiliar knowledge that the young master, her master, was once again beneath this roof. When a footman stumbled through the doorway, carrying a silver tureen, spilling half its contents onto the floor, Charlotte caught it before it struck the ground. "Careful," she murmured, though her own hands trembled. The dish was meant for the head table. The housekeeper's eyes were on her, sharp as frost. "You must take it yourself," the woman hissed. "The Duchess Dowager demands it replaced at once, and there's no one fit to go." Charlotte hesitated. A cook's daughter had no place in the Duke's dining room. But disobedience was not an option. She wiped her hands, steadied her breath, and carried the tureen through the servants' corridor, up the narrow stair where candlelight trembled against the walls. The noise of conversation met her like surf, laughter, the clink of glasses, the murmur of strings from a small ensemble hidden in the gallery. The hall shimmered with gold and ivory, the scent of roses and wine heavy in the air. Charlotte kept her eyes lowered as she approached the table, her plain dress, an apron a stark contrast to the silk and jewels surrounding her. "Ah, the cook herself," drawled Lady Pembroke, her voice sweet and poisonous. "How charming. The Duke's homecoming truly brings out every level of society." Her companions laughed softly behind gloved hands. Charlotte felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but said nothing. She placed the tureen upon the sideboard, bowed slightly, and turned to leave. "Stop!" The voice cut through the laughter like a blade. Alexander had spoken, though he had scarcely raised his tone. He sat at the head of the table, his uniform replaced by black evening dress, a single silver ring glinting on his hand. His gaze was unreadable, but the room obeyed him instantly. "The lady of the house is unwell," he said evenly. "I will not have her staff mocked in her absence." A hush fell. Lady Pembroke stammered something about misunderstanding, but the Duke had already turned away. Charlotte could feel every eye upon her. Her only thought was to escape, to reach the sanctuary of the kitchen before her composure broke. When she finally descended the last stair, her knees gave way. She caught herself on the wall, heart hammering with humiliation and something she could not yet name. Pride warred with shame, gratitude tangled with fear. She could still hear the echo of his voice, calm, precise, and strangely protective. That night, while the ballroom thundered with reels and laughter above, Charlotte remained below, scrubbing copper pans long after the others had gone to bed. She worked until her fingers were raw, her mind replaying every moment of that brief humiliation. It was nothing, she told herself. A servant's misstep, a nobleman's courtesy. But somewhere in the quiet recess of her chest, a spark had been struck. In his chamber, Alexander stood by the window, the snow's reflection pale upon his face. He had not meant to speak, yet the cruelty in Lady Pembroke's tone had cut through him. He told himself it was justice, not interest, propriety, not pity. But the image of the young woman's steady hands, her composure under ridicule, lingered against his better judgment. He, who had endured cannon fire without flinching, could not shake the memory of her eyes, startled, defiant, and bright as glass. Outside, the wind keened across the moors, carrying with it the promise of another storm. The servants whispered that it would last for weeks, that the roads would vanish beneath snow. Alexander listened to the windows rattle and thought, not of London or Parliament, but of the kitchen below, where one woman's quiet dignity had disturbed the stillness of his mind. And as midnight passed, the narrator's voice would say, had one been there to hear it, then in the depths of winter, in a house divided by rank and silence, two souls had noticed one another, and nothing in Hawthorne Hall would ever be quite the same again. The storm did not end. It thickened day after day, until the world beyond Hawthorne Hall vanished behind a curtain of white. Roads disappeared beneath drifts higher than a carriage wheel, and the silence of the moors was broken only by the wind's mournful cry. The household became a fortress of isolation, its fires struggling to keep the cold from creeping into every room. Within this frozen confinement, the rhythms of duty shifted. Servants fell ill, supplies dwindled, and the grand routines of nobility shrank into necessity. It was in that narrowing of distance that Charlotte Whitmore and the Duke of Wexford began to move within the same orbit. The fever took the housekeeper first, then the butler, and before the week was through, nearly all the upper servants were bedridden. The Duchess Dowager had retired to her chamber with headaches and complaints, leaving the management of the house to chaos. Orders faltered. Meals went uncooked. It was Charlotte who stepped forward, not from ambition, but from instinct. She reorganized the scullery, rationed the stores, and took command of the kitchen as though born to it. Her calm authority steadied the staff, though she herself scarcely slept. One evening, while the snow hammered at the shutters, Charlotte carried a tray to the drawing room. The Duke had refused supper, she was told, but she would not have him go unfed. The fire there burned low, and he sat alone beside it, one hand resting on a folded letter. His gaze lifted when she entered. "I was told the servants were indisposed," he said, "and now the cook's daughter performs every role in a household." "I do what must be done, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady but soft. Hunger makes no distinction of rank. A shadow of amusement touched his face, the first trace of warmth she had seen in him. "No, it does not," he said, gesturing for her to set the tray near the fire. "You have a sensible tongue, Miss Whitmore. It is not common below stairs." "I have little cause to use it," she answered before she could stop herself. His eyebrow rose, and she lowered her eyes quickly. "Forgive me, sir. I meant no disrespect. None taken." His tone gentled. "It is refreshing." He reached for the bowl of broth she had prepared, tasted it, and paused. "My mother's recipe," he murmured. "I had not thought anyone remembered it." "Mrs. Whitmore taught it to me when I was a child," Charlotte said quietly. "She said your lady mother favored thyme over parsley." Something shifted in his expression, an old grief, tender and unguarded. "You knew her well, then?" "As a servant knows her mistress, Your Grace." From a distance, and with gratitude. He regarded her for a long moment, and she could feel the air between them thicken, not with impropriety, but with unspoken recognition. Two people, bound by a house that remembered both of their mothers, sitting across the same fire, separated by the entire weight of English society. The wind moaned against the glass, and Charlotte turned to leave. "You should eat while it's hot," she said, bowing slightly. "Wait," he said. She froze. "It was unkind of me, that night in the hall." I should have dismissed Lady Pembroke's remark sooner. I allowed cruelty to linger in my own house. Her voice was almost a whisper. You silenced them, Your Grace. That was more than kindness. It was risk. He studied her. Do you imagine I fear their gossip? I imagine, she said, meeting his eyes, that even a duke cannot silence England. He laughed then, a short, startled sound, and she found herself smiling despite the impropriety. He had the sort of smile that made the air less cold, though she doubted he knew it. Days passed. The storm worsened, yet a strange peace settled within the hall. Charlotte worked tirelessly, often bringing trays herself to the Duke's study or library. Their exchanges grew less formal, not through words, but through silences shared without discomfort. Once, she found him reading by candlelight, his hand trembling slightly from exhaustion. Without a word, she refilled his teacup. His eyes lifted grateful. No thanks were spoken. None were needed. Gossip, however, needs no language. Whispers began among the few servants still standing. They noted her absences from the kitchen, the Duke's sudden attentiveness to the hearth. One maid suggested Charlotte was courting ruin. Another claimed she had already achieved it. The air thickened with speculation. It reached its height one afternoon when two visiting gentlemen, stranded by the snow, lingered near the drawing-room fire. Charlotte entered to clear the tea service and heard them speak her name. The Duke's charity seems to have grown warm indeed, one said, smirking. A cook's daughter in his private company. Surely he means to improve her station. Their laughter stung like frostbite. Before she could retreat, a shadow fell across the threshold. Alexander had entered, expression composed, voice steady. You are guests beneath my roof, he said, not judges in my household. Should you find a conversation dull, I suggest the snow offers livelier company. The men stammered apologies. He turned to Charlotte. Leave this to me, he said quietly. But his eyes, those gray, unreadable eyes, betrayed something fierce, protective, and beyond all reason. That evening, he found her again in the kitchen, standing near the window where snowflakes drifted against the glass. I owe you an apology, he said. You owe me none, Your Grace. Her hands were folded tightly before her. Words cannot wound one who has long been invisible. He stepped closer, his voice low. You are not invisible. The firelight danced across his features, carving light into shadow. She looked up, startled by the conviction in his tone. You see only gratitude, she said, her voice trembling. It is dangerous to mistake it for anything more. Perhaps, he murmured, and yet, I would rather be accused of kindness than cowardice. Neither spoke further. The clock struck 11. Its echo lingered. He left without another word. On the work table where he had stood, Charlotte later found a small, pressed violet laid upon a folded napkin. No message, only the faint scent of summer in a winter that refused to end. She held it for a long time before hiding it in her apron pocket. Above her, the wind wailed through the chimney, carrying with it a whisper she could not name, part warning, part promise. And somewhere in the great, frozen house, the Duke of Wexford stood by a window, wondering when duty had begun to feel like longing. The fever struck the hall without mercy. It crept through the servants' quarters like a thief in the night, felling one after another, until the once bustling household became a warren of whispers and weak candlelight. The Duke ordered physicians from the nearest town, but the roads remained impassable, buried beneath unbroken snow. In those days of sickness and confinement, Charlotte became the heart of Hawthorne Hall. She nursed the maids, tended the fires, and prepared broths to sustain the few who could still rise from their beds. Exhaustion blurred her days into one long stretch of labor, yet she refused to rest. The house seemed to draw its breath through her alone. Alexander watched the slow collapse of his household with growing unease. He had commanded men in war, faced cold and hunger, but this silent decay of domestic order, unnerved him more than cannon fire. Still, he found himself drawn daily to the kitchen door, listening to the steady rhythm of Charlotte's movements within. Her voice, low and calm as falling snow, soothed those she cared for, and he began to realize how her presence steadied more than the servants. It steadied him. Late one night, when even the fires in the drawing rooms had burned to embers, Alexander descended the back stairs, drawn by a faint clatter. He found Charlotte alone, bent over a table, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, the glow of a single candle tracing the hollows of her face. She swayed slightly as she worked, ladling broth into bowls. When she turned, startled by his arrival, her eyes were shadowed with fatigue. "Forgive me," he said softly. "I did not mean to intrude. You needn't apologize, Your Grace. The house is quieter when the world sleeps." He stepped closer, noting the tremor in her hands. "You should rest, Miss Whitmore. You've done the work of 10 servants. I cannot. There are still mouths to feed, and Mrs. Hale's fever worsens by the hour." He reached to take the ladle from her, his gloved hand brushing hers. "Then allow me." She froze. "Your Grace, I have stirred worse cauldrons in the army," he said, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Permit me this small rebellion." Too weary to protest further, she watched as he stirred the pot, awkward but sincere. The simple act, an English duke at a servant's side, felt like an inversion of the world's order. For the first time, the air between them held no rank, no rule, only shared humanity. As they worked in silence, her strength failed her. The spoon clattered from her hand. She swayed and caught the edge of the table. He was beside her in an instant, his arm around her waist. "Charlotte," he said, her name, spoken for the first time. Her breath caught. "I'm well," she murmured, though her voice trembled. He guided her to a chair, his touch steady, his expression fierce with concern. "You are not well. You burn like the fevered. You must rest." "You should not." She tried to rise, but he pressed a hand gently to her shoulder. "Hush," he said, the word more plea than command. "Let me care for you just this once." Her eyes met his, and in that moment, something fragile and forbidden passed between them. He dampened a cloth, touched it to her brow. The gesture was simple, almost reverent. Her lashes fluttered, and her voice, faint as breath, escaped her. "A cook's daughter cannot be cared for by a duke." He stilled. "You think I care for titles now? I think you must." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where snow pressed thick against the glass. "It is the world's way." "The world," he said, his voice roughened, "is an invention of cowards who fear what they feel." Her lips parted, uncertain whether to rebuke or believe him. He seemed to fight something within himself, a battle invisible yet consuming. "You do not know what you say," she whispered. He leaned closer, his hand still resting against her temple. "I know too well. Since that night in the hall, you have not left my thoughts. I have tried every discipline I know to forget you. None avail me." Silence stretched. The clock ticked in the distance, solemn and indifferent. Charlotte drew a trembling breath. "You cannot mean this." "I mean only that I am undone," he said. "By your strength, your grace, your defiance of every line drawn to keep people like us apart." She shook her head, though tears threatened. "You're lonely, not in love. Then let my loneliness name you its cure." Her composure faltered. She rose, unsteady, the firelight flickering over her pale face. "You must not speak so. I am your servant. I cannot." He reached for her hand, stopping her retreat. "Charlotte," he said again, softly, reverently, as though the name itself were an oath. She looked down at their joined hands, at the audacity of it, yet she did not pull away. The space between them narrowed. The candle guttered. His breath brushed her cheek. The first touch of his lips was an accident. Hesitant, almost questioning. Then the world fell away. For one suspended moment, there was no rank, no rule, no England watching. Only the taste of warmth in a house built of cold. When he drew back, he looked stunned, as though he had glimpsed something sacred and forbidden at once. She stepped away, her chest rising sharply. "You must forget this," she whispered. "You must." He bowed his head, guilt and longing warring within him. "If forgetting were possible, I would have done so already." Before either could speak again, the sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor. He turned sharply, regaining composure. "Rest, Miss Whitmore," he said, the mask of authority sliding back into place. "That is an order." She watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him, shutting her in the dim, trembling glow of the kitchen fire. Her lips still burned with the memory of his touch, her heart with the weight of its impossibility. By morning, the fever would break in the house, but not in their hearts. And though she told herself the moment had meant nothing, a folly of exhaustion and pity, she could not bring herself to throw away the violet hidden in her apron. It remained there, pressed and fading, as though holding the proof of a dream she dared not speak aloud. The snow began to melt at last, retreating from the moors in thin, defeated ribbons. The thaw revealed a landscape battered and gray, yet beneath the ruin, green stirred faintly, the earth remembering life. Weeks had passed since the night in the kitchen, but Charlotte still felt the imprint of that forbidden moment, as though the warmth of his breath lingered in the cold air. She told herself it had been folly, born of exhaustion and gratitude, yet her heart defied the discipline her mind demanded. She worked in silence, spoke little, and waited for dismissal that never came. The Duke had left suddenly after the fever broke, summoned to London on affairs of estate. His absence was a wound and a reprieve both. Rumor filled the hollow he left behind. The servants whispered that he had gone to arrange an engagement with some noble heiress. Others claimed the scandal of a kitchen girl had driven him to seek respectability. Charlotte did not ask which story was true. She only knew that when she entered the kitchen each morning, she could still see the ghost of his presence there, the untouched chair by the fire, the faint trace of his voice in memory. Days folded into weeks. The roads cleared, and visitors began to return. Hawthorne Hall stirred from its isolation like a waking creature, shaking off the deep, introspective quiet that winter had imposed. The world's eyes returned, and with them came judgment. The Duchess Dowager emerged from her chambers, restored to her imperious health and appetite for gossip. When she passed Charlotte in the corridor one morning, her glance was sharp and lingering, as if measuring the distance between rumor and truth. By March, the Duke's carriage reappeared at the gates. Charlotte was in the garden, pruning frost-bitten herbs, when she heard the wheels crunch upon the gravel. She straightened, heart fluttering. He stepped out, the same man yet somehow changed, his face leaner, his expression resolved. He looked toward her briefly, a flicker of recognition passing between them, then turned toward the house without a word. It was enough to set her trembling. The following days moved with uneasy precision. Invitations were issued for a gathering of county families. A gesture, the servants said, to restore the Duke's social standing after months of seclusion. Charlotte worked tirelessly to prepare the kitchens, determined that her labor might drown her thoughts. Yet when she passed through the great hall on the morning of the event, she paused. There, upon the central table, stood a vase of violets, fresh, fragile, unmistakable. Her breath caught. No note, no explanation. Only a quiet defiance in the choice of flower, one that no one else would recognize. The guests arrived under a bright, indifferent sun. Laughter spilled across the corridors, the familiar hum of titled voices weaving judgment into conversation. Charlotte remained below stairs until the bell summoned her to oversee the final course. As she crossed the threshold of the dining room, her steps faltered. The Duke stood at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping the room with calm authority. At his right sat the Duchess Dowager, expression carved from marble. The atmosphere was brittle with expectation. When the last toast was concluded, Alexander rose. "My friends," he said, his voice evened but carrying to every corner of the hall, "I thank you for enduring both the storm and my prolonged absence. Isolation brings reflection, and reflection brings clarity. I have returned to this house resolved to set its future upon truth, not custom." A murmur rippled through the room. He continued, his gaze steady. "There is one among my household who has shown more courage and grace than any I have known, one who reminded me what it is to serve not with pride, but with purpose. It is she whom I intend to make my wife." The hall erupted. The Dowager's fan clattered to the floor. Lady Pembroke gasped audibly. Charlotte stood frozen in the doorway, the tray trembling in her hands. "You cannot mean this," the dowager exclaimed, rising. "Alexander, think what you say." "I have thought," he replied, "and I am done thinking only as the world instructs." All eyes turned toward Charlotte. She felt herself burn beneath their stares, part terror, part disbelief. The Duke's gaze found hers, unwavering. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "will you grant me the honor of standing beside me? Not as servant, but as equal?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. The world around her blurred, reduced to the space between them. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice trembling, "you cannot ask what society will not permit." He smiled faintly. "Then let society forbid it." "I shall not." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that decides fates. Then, with slow composure, Charlotte set down the tray, folded her hands, and lifted her chin. "If this is folly," she said quietly, "then I pray it be a noble one." A ripple of disbelief passed through the guests. The Duke crossed the floor to her, every step deliberate. "It is the only noble thing I have ever done," he murmured, his voice for her alone. He took her hand, before the eyes of England's finest, and the hall fell into a stunned, wordless hush. That evening, the manor seemed to breathe again. The scandal spread beyond its walls, carried by carriages and whispers, yet within the great house, peace took root. The dowager retreated to her chambers, defeated by her son's resolve. The guests departed in outraged astonishment, and Charlotte, now no longer servant but promised bride, stood beside the fire where their story had begun, the violet pinned at her breast. The wedding was held quietly at the village chapel 2 weeks later. Snow, as though reluctant to let go of its claim upon them, fell gently through the ceremony. No trumpets, no grand assembly, only vows spoken with trembling sincerity. When the Duke placed the ring upon her finger, she thought of her mother, of all the hands that had scrubbed and served within those walls, and how one touch had rewritten their history. As they left the chapel, the townsfolk bowed, uncertain whether to cheer or stare. The Duke bent to whisper against her ear, "Let them say what they will. The world will tire of its outrage before I tire of you." Charlotte smiled, tears bright in her eyes. The carriage door closed behind them, and the snow thickened, softening the world into white. From the high windows of Hawthorne Hall, a few curious faces watched the carriage disappear down the lane. They would speak of it for years, the scandalous love, the impossible marriage. But history, as it often does, would forget the outrage and remember only the beauty. And if, on some winter evening long after, a passerby glimpsed a Duchess in the garden, gathering herbs by the light of the kitchen window, they might wonder at the quiet happiness that glowed there. For love, once kindled in defiance, burns longest against the cold. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.